There's this, sense of Congress doesn't do anything. Maybe that's true to a lesser extent at the state level, but, the focus is just, whatever committee hearing you're in, getting off your question that's going to go viral on social media versus actually doing any kind of policy work. And every young person I've ever met, they want to do things. They don't just want to, have that viral moment. So how do you have those conversations when you're trying to convince people to run for office?
Well, I think a lot of it is just that if we, in politics, I had a good friend once say to me, if you want to get 100% of what you want, you need 100% of the power. But in democracy, that's never going to be the case, obviously. But even if we want to get anything done, we still need a majority to be able to do that in the first place. And that's part of what we do to help convince these candidates. The vast majority of the work that we've done this cycle, though, just because we started in August after many people had already announced, is finding the candidates that are already running in the first place and really working with them on a day-to-day basis to the point that, obviously we help fund their campaigns. We're grassroots funded. We don't, as an organization, we don't take corporate money. The vast majority of our funding comes from like 86,000 people across the country that have given $5 or $10 to us. But we work with candidates on a day-to-day basis. Just last night, right before I was going to bed, I got a call from one of our candidates at 10:45 at night talking about how his campaign manager had just, stepped away from the campaign and how he needed help on finding a new one. I was like, it's going to be fine. We'll work on finding a new one. But that's the kind of stuff that we work on a day-to-day basis. But in terms of working on actually getting things done, one of the questions that we ask, for example, in our climate section is, are you willing to work across party lines to actually get, energy policy reform passed to make sure that we have things as exciting as high voltage transmission lines, which are extremely important for dealing with the onboarding of renewables that are not going to be providing electricity 100% of the day because, for example, the sun is not always shining or the wind is not always blowing. But in order to be able to handle those higher electric loads, we're going to need to have trillions of dollars, frankly, invested in our electric grid over the next couple of decades to handle all the onboarding of new electric cars, heat pumps, and so much more stuff that is going to be taking electricity. But I think one of the more interesting things that I've seen in my experience so far is that it's actually a lot easier to get boring stuff passed, which makes sense. But there's so much stuff that we actually do agree on that we don't even talk about because it doesn't make it into that media where that is, driven to just divide people and drive outrage as much as possible to get more attention and sell you more ads. And an example is like, everybody wants high school graduation rates to be higher, right? Why aren't we talking about that? Like, it's something that I would think that almost all Republicans could agree on, all Democrats could agree on, and it's not anything crazy, but why aren't we doing that more, right? Or protecting veterans' health care, right, with things like the PACT Act that did get passed. It was the largest expansion, pretty much from my understanding, I'm not the expert here, but from my understanding, it was the largest expansion of, veterans' health care in modern American history. It impacted everybody from people like my dad to the veterans that I met with outside of the Capitol after that bill was sunk the first time out of an act of spite that I'm not going to get into. But there's a lot of things that actually can be done so long as they aren't really seen as a win for either side. And, I think that's kind of what happened with the Safer Communities Act a little bit after Uvalde. Democrats are always talking about the need for universal background checks, red flag laws, and more. And Republicans are always talking about how they want to weaken gun laws effectively because they believe that the answer to gun violence is more guns, which to me is illogical, but, take that as you will. But after Uvalde, one of the main messages that I had that other people had too was, look, I can respect that you don't agree with me on everything or even most things, but I can't accept the fact that none of us wants school shootings to continue or gun violence in general to continue and act as if there's nothing that the most powerful and rich country in human history, that this is the one problem we can't solve, right? And I think from that, what ended up happening is it kind of just created a new policy where they expanded background checks for people under the age of 21, which was not nearly enough. It wasn't as much as I wanted necessarily. Certainly wasn't anything that the right was going to be happy with.
Yeah, I mean, it seems like you are what I hear is that you're trying to embrace compromise where you can and take small victories when you can get them. And it seems like that's a place where the left gets itself into trouble sometimes too, is wanting everything to be, all or nothing. And if it's not exactly the way we want it, we're not going to be happy. Are those conversations that you're having also about how to maybe try to bring people around to the idea of incremental change or compromise without, of course, compromising everything that you believe in too?
I don't even really see it as compromise so much as I see it as us making progress on what we can agree on in the first place, where both parties, have some level of, even if it's small, some small level of overlap in this kind of Venn diagram between left and right. And I don't, I think what a compromise would be was just saying like, all right, we're going to massively weaken gun laws in X, Y, and Z areas just so we can get this tiny expansion of background checks for people under the age of 21 attempting to buy a gun from a federally licensed dealer, right? That would be compromise in my view, and that would not be tolerable. But what we did here is we said, look, right now we have a majority in the House, we have a slim majority in the Senate, and we have the presidency. We're going to get everything we can passed given those circumstances and the fact that we need to get 10 Republicans on board to break through the filibuster. And when it comes down to it, we could have either stepped away from that table and gotten nothing done. People would have died and nothing would have changed. Or we could actually pass that law, saved some lives, not nearly as many as I think we could have had we passed something bigger, but it's much better than the alternative of doing nothing. And more importantly, I think that people don't understand this that are, I don't mean to sound rude saying this, but just aren't politically experienced in like these policy negotiations and on the inside of these debates that happen between senators or politicians is so much of this is about trust and relationships. And if you can show somebody that you're willing to work with them to pass something meaningful that you both agree on, even if it's between a Democrat and a Republican, it helps to show like you're not here to screw them over, right? You're here to help people. You're here to focus on the principles that you say you care about. And when you do that, that's kind of the way that I've come to see the Safer Communities Act is, before the Civil Rights Act, there were smaller pieces of civil rights legislation that were passed that I am sure leaders in the civil rights movement thought were not enough. I certainly don't think the Safer Communities Act was enough, but I think what it did is it showed those 10 Republicans that you can vote for something like this and not lose your election because of it. It's the same reason why we've pushed through votes in the House, for example, on the assault weapons ban, even though we knew it wasn't going to get passed in the Senate, because we were able to show as a party that we could pass that. I was able to show young voters that the party does want to prioritize that. And we were able to show, even for one of the Republicans who voted on it that was still running for re-election, that he didn't lose his re-election, even though he voted for one of the most controversial pieces of gun legislation in the first place. And those things are part of the convoluted way of how you have to actually get legislation done. But it's just building trust and changing the narrative on this issue and showing that there are people who are, frankly, if we need to wait until there are 60 Democrats in the Senate to pass an assault weapons ban, even if we have that, it's not going to happen. Because what they're going to say, and I know this because I've had many conversations with the type of people that would be in charge of that, what they'll say is it's really important. And we know that, effectively that they've raised tens of millions of dollars off of talking about the need to ban assault weapons, but that they want to preserve these 10 seats because they're in more moderate states that are more red. And they're not going to pass that legislation, so they're going to pass something smaller. So if we have to wait until one party is fully in power to address gun violence, we are fundamentally going to fail. We have to show that this is electorally popular and be, in some ways, pragmatic about how to just be laser focused on getting legislation done, building trust with people, especially on the inside of the Beltway, frankly, where they know that these Republicans know that they can work across the aisle with Democrats and not be committing political suicide doing so. And there's been so much fear for decades around this issue that it's going to take a long time to work through that. But the more pressure we put on, the more we keep doing this work and coming at it from different angles, whether it's youth advocacy, PACs and super PACs, and running people for office, eventually one of those ways or multiple of those ways are going to work and create that change.